My name is Lisa Doran. I'm the Deputy Director for Curatorial Engagement here at the Williams College Museum of Art. And I am pleased to welcome you as we gather together in this space at Williams College, which we respectfully acknowledge sits on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, and commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Tonight's keynote lecture by artist Heather Hart is kicking off tomorrow's symposium, Women Shaping Space, Feminism and Materiality, organized in conjunction with the exhibition Mary Ann Unger, To Shape a Moon from Bone, on view upstairs in our galleries through December 22nd. These events were lovingly crafted by a dream team of collaborators, including Allison Kaufman, director of the Mary Ann Unger Estate, Horace Ballard, the exhibition's curator, and the Theodore E. Stebbins Jr. Associate Curator of American Art at the Harvard Art Museums, Eve Biddle, artist, co-founder of the WSAIC Project and Unger's daughter, along with WICMA program staff. We hope that you'll join us tomorrow, starting at 10 a.m. at the 62 Center for Theater and Dance, for this series of talks and discussions that consider the work of Mary Ann Unger and look beyond her pioneering practice to a landscape of curators and artists working at the intersection of large-scale sculpture, public art, material experimentation, and feminist practice. As we thought together about these themes, artist Heather Hart leapt immediately to mind. She works at the intersection of all of these ideas, engaging the politics of space, and through her sculptural installations, her drawings, public artworks, she proposes redistributions and reclamations of power structures that have conspired to define our built environment. Heather's deep commitment to questioning historical belief systems and providing opportunities for viewers to become active participants in these explorations in playful yet rigorous ways really sets her practice apart. I refer you to Heather's full bio in the program, but briefly I will note here that her work has been exhibited widely, including at the Queens Museum, Storm King Art Center, the Kohler Art Center, the Seattle Art Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and the University of Toronto Scarborough, among others. And she has received grants and awards from numerous foundations, including Anonymous Was a Woman, the Graham Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Warhol Foundation. Hart is also an assistant professor at Mason Gross School of Art and Design. We are so grateful to Heather for launching our symposium program tonight. Her talk is titled Cuts Through Worlds. Please join me in welcoming Heather Hart.
Hi, everybody. So I'm also going to start by gratefully acknowledging that we're on the stolen and traditional and ancestral lands of the Mexicanec people who made their homes in and around the area we now call Williamstown, as colonialism is a current ongoing process. I'd also like to pay tribute to the stolen and enslaved peoples whose labor and lives built economies of this region and made it possible for Williams to inhabit this space today. Okay. These are some of my ancestors. We live amongst echoes from our past. When a building is felled, there are scars in the concrete that remain. There are documents and memories and stains. This affects our foundation and directs where we build in the future. I'm nervous. And I don't memorize things like this, so forgive me for reading to you tonight. Thank you, Lisa and the Williams and Unger folks and Eve for inviting me here to talk to you today. At first, when I was writing, I wanted my keynote to be entirely theory and grand proposal for life as a woman sculptor. But that's not where I'm at in the process. So instead, I'm going to do what I say I hate to do. I'm going to talk about myself. And you will likely all know more than you should about me at the end of the night. I'm going to start with a bit of storytelling about what brought me to my research before I get into what I'm doing now, in hopes that it might tease out a bit of space shaping and material practice and texture through a womanist lens. And although I will save images for tomorrow's panel discussion, I hope you might find some intersection with what I share today, the stuff that I'm enthralled by. I'll leave some frayed edges and meandering loops of fact and fantasy and fractals we can follow a little later on if we'd like to. You have to abandon every day of your past and accept it. And if you can't accept it, then you have to do sculpture. You see, you have to do something about it. If your need is to refuse to abandon the past, then you have to recreate it. That's what I do. Louise Bourgeois. I have so many stories, but I'll start with my work. Currently, my practice is interdisciplinary, but I call it sculpture most of the time. I look for the intersection of my personal narrative and my interest with the site itself. A large percentage of the work I create may be claimed by anyone. I want to reflect on an idea that their frames of reference and activation of this piece is critical to legibility. The work is site-specific and generated after research. I fuse fabricated and historical belief systems, legends that have been bequeathed through generations, mixed with invention and intuition. I'm interested in a kind of enigmatic space, a liminal space, the threshold. I like to play in the margins. The work simultaneously exists inside and outside, underground and visible, in private and public, as minimal and handmade, in the spiritual and the natural. To further explore this concept, I collaborate to create a series of public programs intended to stretch the actual identity of the sculptures through interpretation of each event. The form transforms conceptually depending on who experiences it and their perception, which is what happens to legends and stories that are handed down in their oral tradition, transformation. Speaking of oral tradition, I also co-founded a nonprofit oral history archive called Black Lunch Table. I'll talk a little more about this later, but I mention it now because although it may appear unrelated to sculpture, I see it as consistent with my larger practice. And with the theme of the symposium, it also is a practice of shaping space. I have recently begun to understand my need to explore and play and think about marginal space and the undercommons as a sign that another part of my practice must be pedagogical. In this space, my objective is to facilitate building my students' ability to see, innovate, think bigger, cultivate self-awareness and responsibility, help them gain the skill and mind to make choices, be a community member, a citizen, to be able to critically think and evaluate and discuss work. I want my students to grow with each other into their first independent community. And I want to instill in them tools that are timeless. As Bell Hooks said in Teaching to Transgress, as a classroom community, our capacity to generate excitement is deeply affected by our interest in one another, in hearing one another's voices, in recognizing one another's presence. I began searching for a way to really activate my work back when I was in undergraduate school, trying to fit myself into being a painter. Don't get me wrong, I love painting. Well, I had a love-hate relationship with it. I loved the paint. That material looks so yummy. I mean, like literally, like, what do they call that, pica? Maybe that, but really, maybe you just call it an artist. Anyway, with painting, I never knew when I was done. Is it done? I don't know, maybe 2 years later, maybe more. For me, it was always also missing something. I wanted the form I was making to connect to my material and to contribute more to the meaning. I was also so frustrated with the underpinnings of what painting was for me, and that it was so difficult to point to what the connection was that my viewers might have. They could so easily walk past it or think that they read it at a glance and just keep moving. I wanted to make something that lasted in a viewer's mind longer than the moment in a gallery, or to require more active viewership. So after a long time resisting the sculpture that I had learned at home, my parents met in art school, and after working for a furniture designer for 2 years, I realized that sculpture was my field. Here, there remained room between the idea and the outcome to explore a little bit. It had a more concrete conclusion that I loved. I was able to make a plan that had an end. And I started experimenting, making things to more physically involve my viewers. My rooftop sculptures are built full scale, but removed from the house and dropped from the sky onto the ground or emerging from the earth. I offer a space for visitors to climb on top and claim it as their own for a bit, literally changing their perspective on the world as a metaphor for potential ideological examination. The attic inside my roofs are more private and contemplative by nature, and they ask the visitor to crouch into a window and to access the private space, finding evidence of history, secrets, and fantasies, as attics do offer. I want to amplify human resonance in built space. My work begins with engaging a person in a new translation of our socio-political and racial climates through spaces, through structure, through architectures. It is about asking them to reclaim power, territory, a place, a relationship that may not have been recognized. Architectures influence our navigation of space and therefore our perception of the world. This work is about captivating the viewer in their rich and fraught histories, the gravity, through a playful and disarming disruption of physical engagement, the levity, creating an experience that echoes farther than a pass-through, a walk-by, or a pause and sit. I want participants to take an active role in considering architecture and mining their relationship to a space. My first really large public sculpture was in 2010, more than 10 years after my undergraduate experience. I was an artist in residence and had decided to try to re-perform how to build as my father had taught me. This was my first rooftop sculpture. The project for me was about memory and stability as it applied to structure and architecture. I had to remember what the material components were so that I could plan and so that people wouldn't fall through the rafters. I knew that my father taught me to put studs 2 foot on center, so that's what I did. I visited with the director of the residency before beginning my build. This person said only one thing to me: make it bigger. So that's what I did. This performance of remembering how to build alone was absurd. I would screw in a board, level it, unscrew one end, level it, screw it in again, level it. In the last week of a 5-week install, I realized I needed help. So I was appointed an assistant and finished the build. But because I didn't build it on site, I had to create it in 3 pieces that were put into place with cranes. And so I needed more people to help set it in place. And when I finished the installation, I laid on the hot shingles to soothe my sore muscles. As a child in the 80s, the hot asphalt shingles of our home's roof which I helped lay, were an oasis where I could bake in the sun and listen to music while reading. I would get a ladder because my home didn't have dormers, and I would climb up, and then my cousin would grab the ladder so I couldn't climb down. I don't remember if I cared anymore. Dr. Brian Diaz recently explained that his lab had scientifically proven that while we know trauma can carry into the next generation through RNA, so too can powerful joy. I always wonder how form might exist as triggers for these inherited traumas and joys. Later in the 80s, I lived with my father and my siblings and cousin. Yes, the one that took the ladder. My cousin was a year older than me, and he and I went to the same high school in Seattle where I grew up. I was generally a good kid, but I do remember having one blowout fight with my father because my cousin's curfew was later than mine. Yet I got the good grades. Does this sound familiar to any women in the audience? At the time, I couldn't muster empathy for my dad in that situation, trying to keep a girl child safe. I could only see the inequality. I need to remember to thank my dad for this soon, because I really think this was the period in my life where I embraced rebellion and the irony of being a daddy's girl. Sorry, Mom, I love you too. I mean, it was possible. It's probably also because I'm a Taurus with a Gemini rising and an Aquarius moon. But really, this pursuit for space that the world told me I shouldn't have, but that felt like mine, ignited a tenacity and audacity here. Jumping forward again. In 2011, I had the opportunity to realize this public sculpture I'd made at the residency inside the Brooklyn Museum. In 2011, I was also diagnosed with breast cancer for the first time. Yes, there were 2 times. I had a choice of canceling my installation or continuing the work, and I chose to continue. This time I hired a different cousin to help me. That way I could tap out and lay down if it was too much for me that day. But the work actually fueled me. In the end, I think the space that I was in of healing was imbued into the work. The interior of that rooftop, which is now a series of rooftops I call oracles, was again the more intimate space. At the end of the attic space, I built a chimney skylight that looked up into the atrium glass ceiling of the museum. I had found a fireplace hearth that was forged in the year of my birth and placed it in the wall under the chimney and painted a mural that surrounded it. Visitors were invited to take a piece of gold leaf and press it to the mural in exchange for their wish or prayer, much like a Buddhist temple. Inside the hearth, where the fire would be, I placed an Egyptian-style mirror made of brass. So when visitors pressed the gold for their wish, they would actually catch a glimpse of themselves, concluding that they were really the ones with the answers, that they held the power. I had crowdfunded part of this roof, and one of the rewards was having your name burned into the trusses. So when we opened the exhibition, there was this smell, more than just wood, and also this written evidence of people all around the inside. Then the registrar contacted me to figure out protocol for interaction inside the roof. I've learned that I'm often the registrar's nightmare. The visitors followed the semiotics of the burned names and wrote their own names and messages. This was one of the beautiful ways that visitors finished the piece as collaborators. Out of the entire run of the show, there was only one single message written in the roof that had any negativity, and that was only profanity. Almost all of these messages were written as evidence of the person's experience in that space, like a guest book or Timmy was here. My work has been labeled generous, but really, I contest this. It's clearly the visitors who are the generous party. They complete my work. They implicate themselves and are willing to take risks, and they trust me. I'm just the trickster. Speaking of tricksters, one thing I haven't shared with you yet is that I grew up hearing all sorts of stories about Williamstown. My dad grew up down the block from here, and most of his formative years were spent living in the apartment behind the frat house that is now the police station. His father grew up here too, as my great-grandfather moved here 10 years before the Great Migration. So the next step in my research was to make my way here, wandering past my family landmarks, the Green River, the house my grandfather built, the place my dad grew up, and to the Williamstown Historical Museum, where I unexpectedly encountered a photo of my grandfather on their entry wall. After sharing my surprise with the archivist, she was excited to bring me boxes of Hart ephemera, an archive they hold, where I found an essay that was based on an interview with my great-grandfather written by a student at Williams. I knew he had been a chef for the college for almost 50 years, a position that was eventually bequeathed to his son. And I knew Harry Sr., the son of a slave, had moved north from Virginia at 17 years old, alone, sending for his family years later. But the essay mentioned a tribe in Africa from which we descended. This is a dream for so many African Americans, and I was emotionally overwhelmed, so I called my father, who sounded apathetic. After prodding him to tell me why he wasn't as moved as I was, he said that this detail about our family was likely fabricated. He was the town character, my dad said. Yet, I don't think my great-grandfather had constructed a persona just to forge a fantastic life, nor for attention or for honor. But for his time, it created a space for survival. My dad compared what I do to my great-grandfather, likely that I may be a bit of a character in his eyes too. I may have some trickster tendencies, but I mean, I'm an artist. So I fabulate and fabricate systems and spaces and ritual. What else might I have inherited from Harry Sr.? My job is literally to fantasize and be audacious. This is where I think the conversation actually begins. An artist's imagination and the meaning of real space. James Baldwin said, "An artist must make real the wonders of the world." Reality. Yeah. Like many Black folks, I began my research really with my own story. I grew up searching for myself, or rather I began the story with the story of my father's mother, Minnie. I was following my father's line, searching for Minnie Wells in the archives, as my dad calls them, before Ancestry.com. My father took us to the archives regularly, and we were able to trace most of his family to 1860, where slavery robbed their identities. But we hadn't been able to find my great-grandfather's mother, Minnie Wells, earlier than 1880 census. Not a huge surprise since she was born a slave in North Carolina. So in 2011, I took a research trip with my sister that led me to from my home in Brooklyn to a very small town in Manny's Neck, North Carolina. After listening to a mixtape of my mother's vast record collection twice, following paper maps far out of range of my mobile service, I found a local library in the nearest town. There, I found a microfiche for an 1877 marriage license of my great-grandfather's father. It was a marriage between Julius Hart and a Winnie Wells, but I knew her name was Minnie. With one letter error in transcription, Minnie had disappeared for over a century. The census taker's transcription lost her. Our factual records are full of errors like these. A census taker's handwriting, perception, or translation changes a name or a race or a date, and that changes our history. and in turn our truth, our reality. I was thinking a lot about this faith we have in the written record and oral histories. I'm captivated by this slippage, this liminal space between truth and fantasy, between what I say and what you hear and what we value. There's power in this threshold of interpretation. Literary critic Frank Kermode wrote that both an author's or a reader's forgetfulness helps interpretation. Because of the human brain, and maybe even more so because of my chemo brain, there's a space for creativity and space to claim and gift power in these stories, these histories. And what are these spaces, these forms that are bequeathed and inherited? What is between the lines? What is left unsaid? What and why is the fantastic for Black Americans? And let's talk about the importance of power in authorship. As an artist, I've been trained to see, to pay attention. This is how you learn to draw in art school. We're trained to slow down and to not make assumptions, to really look and understand form in order to ultimately have command of a medium, command of reality as a tool to dream. The goal was to become fluent in reality in order to have a choice of when to control it and when to let go. So I have been motivated to understand why I still initially miss seeing certain things and what it is that I'm not actually seeing at all. What connects one bit of what I noticed to my other experiences. It's no surprise then that I co-founded Black Lunch Table, originating as an artist project in 2005 with my co-founder, SAIC professor, associate professor Gina Valentine. Our primary aim is the production of discursive sites wherein cultural producers engage in dialogue on a variety of critical issues. We host roundtables that are recorded and transcribed and metadata tagged for dynamic searchable archive. We host Wikipedia workshops with the goal of filling gaps in the archive with records of Black visual artists and all articles that are systematically missing. Black Lunch Table mobilizes a democratic rewriting of contemporary cultural history by animating discourse around and among the people living it. As the past few years have seen the most public dialogue around issues of race in recent history, this project has provided a critical platform for exchange, staging, and recording community roundtable discussions at institutions internationally. And the archive hosts these conversations we are all having. And it is a space in tech founded by Black women. As with its creation of physical space that reify community and generate critical dialogue, the archive provides a digital space for a community-driven approach to art, historical authorship, and discourse on Black studies and social justice issues. So you can understand the overlap that Black Lunch Table has with what I normally do. I think it feeds into how I think about the ecosystems of communities, including the academic community. I'm always looking for how I might fit into a space, the metadata tag or keyword that I'm perhaps searching for, the place that I can inhabit and push off from, a place to anchor my footing and expand and take up space. Take up space. Take up. To occupy, to pursue further, to become engaged in pursuit of space, outer space, space versus place. Space is the place. An expanse which is free, available, unoccupied. A blank between words, a lacuna, a dimension, an area. I'd like to take up space. I think about linguistics a lot, semantics if you haven't guessed. I love puns and Freudian slips and metaphors and callbacks. I'm interested in how we inhabit this world, I'm interested in how we take up space, audacity, how we feel entitled to it, how that space affects us, affects our navigation and the way we move through our lives, and how it influences our identity, our sense of self, our interactions with others, or our vision of the future. Who is the author of these spaces? Might that author change? What is my territory? What is yours? Do they overlap? What part of the space holds power of that site? If it was fragmented, would it still hold that same power? If it were to be recontextualized, would it be legible? If it were fragmented in a different way, would that same aura come through? So, as I said, I learned to build from my dad, a carpenter. But I also quickly learned that every collaborator, fabricator, and build team that I've worked with has imprinted on me and my work. Every experience is different. Everyone I've worked with has had slightly different semantics and semiotics, which really is exciting because while I grew up with my dad's language, calling a screw and a nail the same thing, go nail that board over there, I get to constantly learn new perspectives and perceptions, language and communication every time I build something big. And I love that the nature and scale of my work demands me to collaborate and to think about networks of people every day. As much as I love research and the serious business of finding ways to develop collaboration and the feeling of finding community, I love play. I think it disarms people and allows them an alternative psychological, somatic access to content. I've built a practice that allows me to play with others and experiment, to fail and make it bigger. I admit there's been many times when I've met a fabricator and I can see the glint of suspicion in his eye, thinking, it's cute that I want to build something from wood, or so big, or with tools. And when I was young, I got mad. And I would shut them down immediately, or hire someone else, or call sexism or racism, which wasn't wrong. But now, because perhaps I'm a bad feminist, or a womanist who understands the lens I bring to the world, occasionally now, I'll just let them keep digging themselves into a hole and keep talking. And sometimes through semantics in the process of building with me, they'll see parts of who they're really dealing with. And other times, I'll let them stay not knowing. Because I might not really care at the moment. And because I'm not required to take up that battle today. Because I want to shape my world when and where I choose. Anything worth having is going to take energy, intention, and collaboration. And if I choose not to do that work, that's on me. I'm not obligated to be responsible. It is my privilege to be possessed as an artist. This energy and intention is not always comfy. It is sometimes heavy and feels hopeless, but it does teach me to be adaptable and flexible. And if I do want something, I have to face towards it, and sometimes I have to fight for it, and I need collaborators to help me keep your head up. I need to speak up when I can and accept the process with love and clarity. My goals were never the same as other folks. I ate the toast so that I could have the jam. My artwork might have included objects, but they were more about the interaction between my audience and the situation I placed them in. And the forms, if there were any, mimed these thresholds: the roof, a porch, a staircase, a stoop, a space of transition. In this in-between was where the heart was, the aura, the essence, the lesson, and the growth. I believe in the power of possibility of threshold space. Liminality holds a prompt for the future, that I can believe and that I believe can offer transformation and reclamation of space that plays with mystery or affect, that can be reparative or claimed. These are the margins that Bell Hooks talked about, the gap, the hold. A threshold is a site for reclamation of power, of influence in space. As a public sculptor and an oral history archivist, my most recent work has been seeking to quote Black space. Originally intended as a series of sculptures that centered on unpacking and replicating overlooked elements and thresholds in architectural spaces from notable Black narratives, the series has necessarily evolved. When I started this research, and began thinking, reading, and taking pictures, after sifting through spaces where my ancestors were invisible, I realized most of what I was finding was either full of trauma or very vague. I found a balcony for the Lorraine Hotel. I found slave quarters. I found Edmund Pettus Bridge. I decided that although I wouldn't edit out the pain, I needed to broaden the approach to sourcing what notable narratives of Black space meant. So I revised my structure a bit and took time for a more general approach to finding space that my research and my own narrative felt connected to. I traveled north, south, east, and west through this, and my time as a Radcliffe Fellow, I discovered that what I was looking for was not necessarily formal architecture, and that some of these spaces of trauma could actually be read as spaces of resistance and optimism. Sometimes this space is an arrangement of rocks, and sometimes it's cartographic, a path, and at other times it's empty space with tangible form only described in words and left to the imagination. My frame of reference needed to shift. So I began looking at oral history, fantasy, and broadening architecture to structure or built environment to include in this collection that I was building. What if I included Uhura's workstation, or Nola Darling's bed, or Carrie Mae Weems's kitchen, or Oprah's couch, or the place my neighbors fell in love? In Savannah, I was inspired by the haint blue ceilings in the slave quarters and of the city dwellings. In Buffalo, I was fascinated by the visible history of this telescoped house in the Black neighborhoods. In Great Barrington, there's the historic site of W.E.B. Du Bois's childhood home, where only bricks remain amongst the trees. In Frankfurt, there's a ton of conversation about the validation of sites of lynching on the bridges involving soil samples, oral histories, written histories, and group organizing. Multiple people talked about the high school gym that was to be replaced in Wilmington, where Michael Jordan had his start. I'm finding narratives of local denizens through talking with folks and spending time reading old newspapers and material in local libraries, reading sci-fi and listening to music. This project has gotten muddily dense, and now is beginning to refine again, as any art project should, has happened with most of my work. And then what happens to the legibility and narrative of a space if only the railing from the balcony where Martin Luther King was assassinated was installed in a white cube gallery? As visitors climb onto the balcony, will tracing the structure with their hand make them remember? Will there be clues through somatic experience? Will this white cube become a Black space? I want to focus on the translation between the sites of historical record and the public in my work, and the slippage, construction, and communication that happens in between all of these. I want work to act as a translator in a speculative language between architectures and the public eye. I value fantasy as a tool for building and reclaiming space for marginalized stories. Fantasy incepted by artists, mingled indistinguishably with fantasy in real-world conversation. Fantasy as mutable reading of space. It is from this world that we can picture the breadth of possibility. So, from this point forward, I'm proposing an exploration, an exercise, an action. I'd like you to think about your relationship between your body and the world right now. I'd like everyone to close their eyes for a moment and visualize along with me. First, take a deep breath in and out. Another breath in, all positive vibes. And slowly breathe out any kind of tension or nerves or negativity. Okay, with your eyes still closed, while you're slowly breathing, please think of a favorite project you've completed, one that you're most proud of. If you're not an artist, feel free to think about projects in your fields or homes. We're all creative. Okay, so you have this project in your mind now. Now imagine that you had the opportunity to recreate that project with no limits, no space, location, or budget limitations, unlimited resources. What does that project look like? Picture that for a moment. Okay, you can slowly open your eyes again. Take that revised vision of your project and write all of the impossibilities down, so you will always have a log of ideas that you can make into possibilities and then into realities. Because this world needs more imagination. We need artists to be visionaries. We need more women artists and more subaltern artists and more Black artists and more artists speaking from a threshold. Okay, so I'll leave you with this mantra that Octavia Butler wrote and used. And I invite you to post this on your walls like I have. I will find the way to do this. So be it. See to it. Thanks.
For a few questions, if people have any questions. For
Sure.
I have one about your rooftops, and given the recent climatic changes we're having in the world, and maybe when you were first making them, that wasn't a part of your thinking, but boy, is it a strong image now, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a nerd, so I think like almost any piece that I do has a ton of onion layers, but you can't tell everybody everything all at once. And, you know, I think that when I was making that first one in 2010, it was, it's weird to call it an anniversary, but that's what they called it, the anniversary of Katrina, of the storm. And so I was thinking a lot about that, and I was on the Mississippi. And so I was thinking about geographically like folding with a, equatorial line, so that I was in Minneapolis and I would end up in Louisiana if we split the United States in half that way. So it was there. And there's also reasons that I hadn't or probably won't create that piece in Louisiana or, Galveston or anything near there, I think not only is it kind of a maybe re-traumatizing, but I also think it flattens the work a little bit. Like I love being able to have a piece open enough to have different reads. And so I think if it was in that space, it would really only have one read. But I appreciate you finding that.
Well, I'll have photos tomorrow. So.
Yeah, and if people think about
Thinking about your rooftop sculptures and Alice Aycock's Little Buildings for Mary, and I'm wondering if that's ever.
I'm sorry.
Alice Aycock's Little Building for Mary, and if you know that work, the work she built, on property where she.
Yeah, I know the building for Mary. Is that
I was wondering if that ever played into your thoughts.
It didn't originally,
Yeah.
but I've found so much I don't know if there were subliminal messages or coincidental or what have you. I think in 2010, I can't say I was the most versed in sculpture in general yet. And so I eventually did a piece at Storm King and I was like, right, Alice Aycock. So yeah, I like that kind of echo, I guess.
Thank you for the stories you shared, living your story with us. And very much thank you for the meditation and visualization and the final words.
Thank you for listening.
I'm just curious, you talked about in one of your installations, you were talking about the registrar's nightmare, about how people added their messages, and everything was pretty positive or maybe good, or how do you? I'm trying to think of the exact question I have, but how do you? What goes into making sure that happens? Or how do you deal with the uncertainty or not knowing what will happen when the public comes into your...
I mean, for me, I think it's a lot of trust. For registrars, that might be very different. So, I think the first conversation that I usually have with registrars is establishing that it's wood. It can be sanded out. And I do want to trust the visitors, I think that's just, they're trusting me, so that's the least I can do. And then, especially with participatory work, it's there's no way you can plan for everything. There's always going to be an X factor, so you can batten down the hatches and have all this expensive stuff and monitoring, blah, 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 but then why? They're always going to, people find ways, that's our nature. So I think it's just kind of an ongoing process. There's been a couple of places where I'm I guess if there's anything that's beyond cursing, anything that's offensive to somebody or hurtful, then I would probably want that sanded out. But it's never happened. I have other stories. There was once where I installed a porch piece, and I had a call from the registrar in a panic. Well, first it was a police call, I think. Call from the police asking if I had collaborated with somebody. This is weeks after the piece opened, and I was like, what? What are you talking about? So I was like, no. And so after I hung up with the police, the registrar called me, and they're like, so somebody wrote in Sharpie, giant Sharpie letters over your whole porch, and the porch was probably the size of this room. One letter was this big. They spent time. I have no idea how they did that without anybody seeing them, but that happened. And And so I paused and I was like, oh, okay. Again, it's wood, which is, we can sand it out. But also, like, what did they write? It was a James Baldwin quote. So it's like, you know, these are the kinds of things where it's like you're collaborating with people, and so I had to make a judgment call of like whether that would obfuscate like the ability for that piece to transform and bend and stretch for somebody else. And I did. I thought that it kind of flattened the piece a bit. Like I loved it in my own way, as a moment, as an experience. But I think it was just too much. It wasn't that liminal anymore. And so they actually figured out it was a student who had heard me speak and thought it was like, I don't know, you know, what the issue was, but they thought that it was like kind of the green light, you know. So they just asked him to do the sanding, and it was fine. But you know, it's like you got, you know, this area where work is touchable, you have to be willing to kind of risk. And I think that's another thing that I have always had with this form, is that like it's like as monumental as it is, it still feels kind of ephemeral to me. You know, so I think my paperwork or my small sculptures, that feels like, don't touch it, or like, you know, be careful or whatever. But with the big work, I'm like, we're gonna donate it next week, so you know. So it's fun.
If anybody has other questions, you can hold on to them and share them with Heather over refreshments upstairs at the reception. So I ask everyone to come join us upstairs. But Heather, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody.